Edmund Burke, Part 1. The Vindication of Natural Society. Edmund Burke was born in Dublin in 1729 or 1730. He studied at Trinity College Dublin, from which he graduated in 1748. Burke settled in London, where, some few years later, he produced his earliest works, The Vindication of Natural Society and A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of the Sublime and Beautiful. He began a political career which lasted until his death in 1797, in which, while he never attained political office, he was nonetheless extremely influential. Not everyone is a fan of Burke's writing. William Pitt saw it as largely a mass of rhapsodic effusion that commanded little admiration and no agreement. Tom Paine spends the first 10 or so pages of his Rights of Man attacking what he sees as Burke's unjustified and intemperate attack on the French. He writes, "Everything which rancour, prejudice, ignorance or knowledge could suggest is poured in the copious fury of near 400 pages. In the strain and on the plan Mr. Burke was writing, he might have written on to as many thousands. When the tongue or the pen is let loose in a frenzy of passion, it is the man and not the subject that becomes exhausted." And Marx, notoriously, wrote of Burke in a footnote in Capital that this sycophant, who in the pay of the English oligarchy played the part of romantic opponent of the French Revolution, just as in the pay of the North American colonies at the beginning of the troubles in America he had played the liberal against the English oligarchy, was a vulgar bourgeois through and through. True to the laws of God and nature, he always sold himself in the best market. However accurate this expression of ire is as an indication of Marx's dislike for Burke, it is quite inaccurate as a description of Burke's attitude towards money and commerce. Burke, in fact, did not like the commercial forces that were emerging in his time to vie with the landed interest upon which, in Burke's view, the stability of the British Constitution rested. Burke reveals himself as hostile to the new-moneyed, non-aristocratic interest across the Channel, that is to say, the men who were lending to the government and thus acquiring vast powers. Burke neither supported the bourgeoisie nor had any way of knowing that half a century on they would have risen to irresistible political prominence. So, was Burke a mere gun for hire? Did he choose sides to suit his purse? Jesse Norman expresses the point with commendable clarity. If Paine and Marx are correct in their estimation of Burke's character, this cuts at the root not merely of Burke's achievement, but of his moral authority. If Burke is simply a paid propagandist, a lackey wearing the livery of others, then for all his literary and intellectual brilliance, he cannot be worthy of our respect. Jesse Norman, unsurprisingly, takes a positive view of Burke's life and achievements. Indeed, he not only defends Burke against his critics, but goes so far as to portray him as the earliest postmodern thinker. And a more radical thinker, even than Karl Marx himself. One's views on this matter are likely to be coloured by one's political predispositions, and about this, as about taste, there is no disputing. For the purposes of this chapter, I will take Burke's bona fides as a given and try to assess the value of his thought on its merits, independently of his personal circumstances. In 1756, at the tender age of 27, Edmund Burke published his first work, A Vindication of Natural Society, or A View of the Miseries and Evils Arising to Mankind from Every Species of Artificial Society. It is written in the form of a letter from an unnamed noble writer coming to the end of his public life to another nobleman just entering upon his public career. As its title suggests, the vindication purports to demonstrate the evils that accrue to mankind from what Burke terms artificial society, which is to say, from society organised on the basis of political structures. Despite its being Burke's first publication and his only sustained theoretical treatment of politics, the vindication attracts relatively little attention from scholars today, still less from the general reader. The Vindication of Natural Society and the philosophical inquiry into the origins of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful have always seemed the wayward children in Burke's family of writings. They seem unrelated to the central concerns of his later work, and are usually mentioned in passing as youthful ventures designed merely to secure Burke's entrance into the public world of London culture. So writes Isaac Kramnik in his The Rage of Edmund Burke, Portrait of an Ambivalent Conservative. This common appraisal of the vindication is not one that Kramnik shares. Those scholars who do direct their attention towards the first of these wayward children, by and large, take it to be an early and not wholly successful exercise, satirizing the deistic writings of Bolingbroke. However, at the time of its publication, some readers took Burke to be in earnest in his denunciation of artificial society. And some 50 years ago, Murray Rothbard published an article arguing that the arguments and conclusions of the vindication should be taken literally. Rothbard's effort at literal interpretation was immediately rejected by John C. Weston. He wrote, "The ironic intent of the vindication is immediately clear to all serious students of Burke's thought." So just what does Burke have to say in the vindication? I am aware that Burke is writing a fictional letter, and that it is a critical solecism to assume that the views and opinions of characters in a work of fiction are those of the author. Nevertheless, although the vindication is a work of fiction, it is a work of didactic fiction, so I'm going to refer to its authorial voice simply as Burke. So, Burke begins by reflecting on the changeableness of human nature, its constant restlessness. He writes, "The mind of man itself is too active and restless a principle ever to settle on the true point of quiet. It discovers every day some craving want in a body which really wants but little. It every day invents some new artificial rule to guide that nature which, if left to itself, were the best and surest guide." Burke echoes the Lockean commonplace that the state of nature is inherently inconvenient. These inconveniences include want of union, want of mutual assistance, want of a common arbiter to resort to in their difference. From the product of the union of the sexes comes man's first society with its resultant conveniences. This Burke calls natural society. Had we but stopped at this point in our social development, all would be well, but impelled by our restless nature, unable to leave well enough alone, and impressed by the convenience of natural society, we suppose that a political society formed of the union of many families would be, by analogy, even better than natural society. Alas, it was not to be so. Political societies, or states, have a double relation, externally to other states and internally to their own citizens. The external relations of states are characterized by war. Burke writes, "War is the matter which fills all history, and consequently the only or almost the only view in which we can see the external of political society is in a hostile shape, and the only actions to which we have always seen and still see all of them intent are such as tend to the destruction of one another." Burke now proceeds to give an historical account of the ravages of war, which runs to several pages. The figures he cites of those killed and the extent of the armies employed may, by modern standards of historical scholarship, be exaggerated, but they were drawn from the data available to him at the time he wrote. This catalogue of death and destruction is, according to Burke, chargeable almost exclusively to political society. He writes, "Political society is chargeable with much the greatest part of this destruction of the species. Man in a state of nature has much less capacity for spectacular human destruction." He goes on, "In a state of nature, it had been impossible to find a number of men sufficient for such slaughters, agreed in the same bloody purpose, or allowing that they might have come to such an agreement. An impossible supposition. Yet the means that simple nature has supplied them with are by no means adequate to such an end. Many scratches, many bruises, undoubtedly, would have been received upon all hands, but only a very few deaths." The staggering amount of destruction by human beings of one another, evidence in our sanguinary history, is not the result of some natural, uncontrollable aggression inhabiting the breast of the individual. Burke writes, "Whoever will take the pains to consider the nature of society will find they result directly from its constitution. For as subordination, or in other words, the reciprocation of tyranny and slavery, is requisite to support those societies, the interest, the ambition, the malice, or the revenge, nay, even the whim and caprice of one ruling man among them, is enough to arm all the rest, without any private views of their own, to the worst and blackest purposes." From the aspect of the state's internal relations to its own subjects, Burke offers an argument against artificial, which is to say, political society, that, even if all that he has offered so far should be rejected, would suffice to destroy its pretensions. No government, he believes, can exist without infringing the basic requirements of justice that are incumbent upon every individual. All writers on politics agree, and they are supported in their agreement by experience, that all governments frequently violate the requirement of justice, substituting deception for truth, convenience for honesty, and subordinating all to the political interest. The whole of this mystery of iniquity, writes Burke, is called the reason of state. It is a reason which, I own, I cannot penetrate. What sort of a protection is this of the general right? What is maintained by infringing the rights of particulars? What sort of justice is this which is enforced by breaches of its own laws? He finds it difficult to accept that political institutions that are deemed to be suitable for the furthering of the ends of human society should find it necessary to go against what every individual instinctively knows to avoid. But no wonder, he writes, that what is set up in opposition to the state of nature should preserve itself by trampling upon the law of nature. Burke now proceeds to examine the various forms of government: despotism, aristocracy, and democracy, demonstrating the intrinsic shortcomings of them all. In case it should be thought that the problems he notices are merely problems of application, he tells us plainly, "In vain you tell me that artificial government is good, but that I fall out only with the abuse. The thing itself is the abuse." And he continues over another 10 pages to exhibit the shortcomings of all forms of government. He concludes by pointing out the appalling disparities of wealth that result from the creation of artificial society, with the consequence that only a few are really free, while the many occupy a position of virtual slavery. Once again, he contrasts the artificial with the natural. Excessive labour, and the rich by their enormous luxury, he writes, are set upon a level and rendered equally ignorant of any knowledge which might conduce to their happiness. A dismal view of the interior of all civil society. The lower part broken and ground down by the most cruel oppression, and the rich, by their artificial method of life, bring worse evils on themselves than their tyranny could possibly inflict on those below them. Very different is the prospect of the natural state. Here there are no wants which nature gives, and in this state men can be sensible of no other wants, which are not to be supplied by a very moderate degree of labour. So much for a summary of the contents of the Vindication. Was Burke serious in saying all this, or was he indulging in an elaborate exercise in satire, irony, or parody? The majority of Burke interpreters take Burke's intent in the Vindication to be satirical or ironic. Ian Ousby remarks that the Vindication was an ironical treatise examining the divisions in society. Ian Hampshire Monk notes that in the Vindication, Burke satirized the confident rationalism which the first Viscount Bolingbroke, in his posthumously published philosophical works, had applied critically to religion. He believes the Vindication to be an ironic defence of the state of nature, exercised through a hyperbolically rationalist critique of existing society, in a kind of reductio ad absurdum of deist arguments. Some interpreters, without doubting the overall satirical or ironic purpose of the work, are nevertheless aware that its satire or irony wasn't immediately evident to some of the readers, and to the extent that this was so, the Vindication must be judged to have failed of its purpose. So then, Firmly on the side of the satirical, ironic interpretation of the Vindication we have Ian Isby, Ian Hampshire Monk, and also David Berman, Peter Stanless, F.P. Locke, George H. Smith, Weston, Liam Barry, Woodrow Wilson. Yes, that Woodrow Wilson. Apart from some of Burke's contemporaries, the only person unequivocally on the non-satirical side of the fence is Murray Rothbard. One other person has offered an argument against taking the Vindication as a satire on the grounds that its claims conflict with the greater body of Burke's work. Patrick Ford argues, however, that the anarchism of the Vindication can be found in Burke's anti-revolutionary writings. He writes, "An analysis of Burke's writings and speeches show that he had an affinity for liberty his entire life and almost always saw the state as the enemy of freedom and of traditional order." He cites a passage from Burke's speech on conciliation with America, where Burke writes, "Pursuing the same plan of punishing by the denial of government to still greater lengths, we wholly abrogated the ancient government of Massachusetts. We were confident that the first feeling, if not the very prospect of anarchy, would instantly enforce a complete submission. The experiment was tried. A new, strange, unexpected face of things appeared. Anarchy is found tolerable. A vast province has now subsisted, and subsisted in a considerable degree of health and vigour, for near a 12-month, without governor, without public council, without judges, without executive magistrates." Murray Rothbard takes a very different view of the Vindication, seeing it as perhaps the first modern expression of rationalistic and individualistic anarchism. Was he right to take this view? While Rothbard acknowledges that scholars on the whole accept Burke's apparent revelation in the preface to the second edition of the Vindication, that the work was intended to be a satire, he nevertheless believes that a sober analysis of its contents reveal little that is either satirical or ironic. Why did Burke reveal his real design in the preface to the second edition? In Rothbard's view, he did so because, upon the commencement of his political career, he found his authorship of the Vindication to be an embarrassment, and so attempted to pass it off as a kind of jeu d'esprit. If the work were really a satire, asked Rothbard, why only proclaim it as such when a rising political career was at stake? At the time when he made his claim, Rothbard did so with some justification, for it seems to have been commonly accepted, at least until the 1930s, that the preface to the second edition of the Vindication, in which Burke is taken to have revealed his satirical purpose, appeared in 1765, 9 years after the Vindication's first publication. It was also accepted by some that the point of the revelation of the Vindication's real purpose in the preface was not unrelated to Burke's parliamentary ambitions, which became manifest about this time. T. W. Copeland writes to the effect that when his, that is Burke's, election to Parliament was likely in 1765, he published a new edition of his Vindication of Natural Society, and in the preface he assured his readers that the design of it was entirely ironical. The point of Burke's clarification of purpose in so doing was to limit any possible damage that an imprudent juvenile publication might do to his parliamentary career. Copeland points out that in holding this opinion, Murray appears to be relying on John Morley, who wrote that it is significant that in 1765, when Burke saw his chance of a seat in Parliament, he thought it worthwhile to print a second edition of his Vindication with a preface to assure his readers that the design of it was ironical. But Copeland notes that the second edition of the Vindication, containing the preface with the admission of ironical intent, was in fact produced in 1757, just 1 year after the original first edition. Unfortunately then, for the ad hominem aspect of Rothbard's argument, given that it now seems certain that the preface appeared just 1 year after the Vindication's original appearance, at which time Burke had no political prospects, it is unlikely that Burke explained its purpose away to smooth his path to a political career. Rothbard may have been wrong, although understandably so, in attributing Burke's apparent volte-face to a desire to explain away anything that might damage his embryonic parliamentary career. But he can be forgiven for his failure to detect the satirical intent of the work itself, when such an intent was equally undetectable to such acute contemporaries of Burke as William Godwin and Berry. So convincing was the case made for the shortcomings of artificial society by Burke that few readers of this pamphlet will, without exterior prompting, spontaneously take it to be either satirical or ironic. It has few of the usual hallmarks of satire: hyperbolic exaggeration, the presentation of patent absurdities as if they were commonplaces, the presentation of local truths as if they were universal, as in Jane Austen's opening in Pride and Prejudice, where she says, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife," which of course is a universal truth, only if the universe is limited to early 19th century matchmaking mothers with daughters to dispose of in marriage. Readers might care to recall the words of Burke's contemporary Richard Hurd, who remarked that an erstwhile ironist should take care by a constant exaggeration to make the ridicule shine through the imitation. Whereas this vindication is everywhere enforced, not only in the language and on the principles of Lord Bolingbroke, but with so apparent, or rather so real an earnestness, that half his purpose is sacrificed to the other. And the similar sentiments of William Goodwin, the first chapter whose inquiry concerning political justice and anarchist critique of the state is unashamedly modelled on the vindication. It isn't difficult to see why some readers of the vindication took it at face value. The writing has a passionate intensity, and the indignation has a ring of truth that belies any satirical or ironic reading. Isaac Cramnick points to the vindication's moving description of the grinding poverty of the poor and its radical assault on the oppression by the great and powerful who are responsible for the wretchedness of 9/10 of humanity who drudge through life. Where is the irony in this? This indignation is, for Cramnick, no mere ironic moment, for he believes that we can find in Burke's Reformer of 1748 a very similar exhibition of indignation, this time in a context that no one takes to be ironic or satirical. There, Burke writes, of the natural equality of mankind and its degeneration into the rich in their gilded coaches and their velvet couches, followed by the miserable wretches whose labour supports them. Similarly, the seriousness of the radical views expressed in the tracts relative to the laws against popery in Ireland is never called into question, but this is a radicalism quite akin to that of the vindication, which may well explain why Burke never published the tracts in his lifetime. Here, Burke is, according to Cramnick, saying that men set up artificial institutions of government and law to protect the cherished rights of natural society. But the tendency of these artificial institutions is to demolish natural equality and obliterate natural rights. This is a far cry from the Burke we are used to, writes Cramnick. In the end, Cramnick appears to be on the side of the majority of Burke commentators in the matter of the irony-satire, non-irony-satire debate, writing that in the preface to the Vindication, Burke revealed to all the ironic intent of the book. The essay was no radical threat, he insisted, merely an ironic ploy with which to ridicule Bolingbroke's irreligion. However, he goes on to ask, but was it pure irony? Is it indeed possible to write ironically without giving some weight to what is ridiculed? His thesis is that Burke was an ambivalent conservative, and that in the 1750s he was wrestling with his own ambivalent social views, so that the Vindication was at one and the same time a radical manifesto and a conservative apologia. As such, Cramnick is persuaded that the Vindication is more than mere irony. Perhaps the most nuanced approach to the Vindication is that taken by Frank Pagano, who believes that it reveals the deepest grounds of his, that is, Burke's politics. It is his only purely theoretical writing on politics. It also is a poetic attack upon the pretensions of political theory and a defence of practice. Pagano believes that the Vindication has either been read too seriously or not seriously enough. He holds that the reader should seek the meaning of the Vindication in a concealed below-the-surface plot. While he doesn't deny that there are elements of satire in the text, he also doesn't believe that they are structurally significant. It is not sufficient, he writes, to read the work as a satire of one or more writers. This seems hardly hidden, and it is not, strictly speaking, part of the plot. In this, Pagano departs from the main current of commentators. On the other hand, he is also opposed to reading the Vindication as a straightforward account of Burke's political theory, taking the fictional form in which the work is written as being of more than stylistic significance. Why, one might wonder, does Burke choose this fictional form for his earliest work? Was it simply to conceal his identity as author? Hardly. That could have been done by removing his name from the title page of a straightforward dissertation. According to Pagano, Burke chooses the fictional form not so much because he wishes to conceal his thought or merely to ridicule that of another, but because he finds fiction to be the best form by which to convey his ideas about politics. He believes that Burke deliberately juxtaposes a series of human inconsistencies in the Vindication, all the better to make evident the point that man is a creature constituted of clashing elements. This juxtaposition has, according to Pagano, led some readers to regard the work as a failure. Others adopt the one-sided interpretations mentioned above. In holding this view, Pagano comes close to Kramnik's thesis that Burke was deeply ambivalent in his political views. The literary structure of the Vindication, then, according to Pagano, consists of a plot and an underplot. The plot is essentially a critique of liberal theory. The underplot is a conservative defense of liberal practice. The division of the text into plot and underplot finds justification in Burke's preface, in which he speaks of an underplot which is more significant than the apparent design. While Pagano and Kramnik approach one another's positions, one difference between them might be that Kramnik, while arguing for an unresolved tension in the Vindication, doesn't explicitly locate the elements of this tension in a two-level structure, as does Pagano. According to Barry, Burke explained in his preface to the second edition why he wrote as he did. He adopted, he says, a similar process of reasoning to that of Bolingbroke to show up the shallowness of that gentleman's writings. Therein was what he termed his underplot, of more consequence than the apparent design. But as the underplot has miscarried, and as even its existence has not become apparent to readers during the decades subsequent to the publication of the pamphlet, he now considers it necessary to make his original purpose clear. So writes Barry. On the surface, on the level of the plot, the Vindication seems to support the judgment that, viewed from the foundations, no society and no government are legitimate. The Vindication appears to condemn all civil society. A return to man's natural condition not being possible, the recipient of the letter must either engage in politics or lead a meaningless life. According to Pagano, what looks to be the letter's advocacy of anarchy is a mere appearance, which, when eliminated, leads the letter writer to recommend a conservative position, the underplot. The apparently strong condemnations of the immorality of government, its reasons of state, what Burke calls this mystery of iniquity, is, in Pagano's judgment, simply part of a dialectical strategy. Pagano writes, "The Vindication seems to be a display of how liberal theories of right are continually violated by liberal schemes of government. It is this repeated history of failure which leads to the conclusion that civil society should be abandoned. Indeed, it is hard to see how this final conclusion is wrong, if all the intermediate conclusions are correct. If no society secures right, and if in the state of nature right exists, a return to the state of nature and the abandonment of civil society would seem to be right." But this is not Burke's real position. That position is, rather, to attack the premise that no society secures right. So writes Pagano. The Vindication, then, in the end, is not an either-or, but a both-and. Pagano concludes that the Vindication is a defence of both British artificial or civil religion and the Hobbesian Lockean natural right, because natural rights philosophy is part of the British civil religion. Thus Burke vindicates at one and the same time natural society and artificial society. Are those who take the Vindication at face value, either as being completely serious or completely satirical, wholly mistaken? No. The reason is because the letter surface is correct and much of its teaching unconcealed. Each individual criticism is nearly accurate. Although the work is not wholly a satire, its cumulative effect is satirical because the assumption that reason can uncover the whole truth about society is wrong.